Now, turning to our speaker today, Angelina Diliberto Allen, a longtime Baha'i, author of, as I said, several very valuable and interesting books. John David Bosch in the Vanguard of Heroes, Martyrs and Saints, a 2019 biography of the man for whom Bosch Baha'i School is named. And then, of course, last year, 2021, when the Moon Sets Over Haifa, an account of the passing of the master in November of 2021. She has an MA in Writing and Rhetoric from the University of California, San Diego. She was a high school English teacher for over 30 years in Southern California, where she continues to live with her husband, Andrew Allen. So, without further ado, I will turn all of this over to Angie. Angie, welcome to the Wilmette Institute's webinar, and we really are very much looking forward to hearing your presentation. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you everyone for joining in this and for agreeing to move it to this day. I was stuck in a snowstorm in Northern California and really got the idea of what it's like to not be connected to electricity in the same way that we think about the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá as being really the power that connects us to our faith. It's in thinking about the Wilmette Institute, it's wonderful to think about how the Wilmette Institute relates in so many ways to the topic that we're speaking of today, because the Wilmette Institute is really focused on looking at Baha'i approaches to social transformation. And our thinking about the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá is really the blueprint for social transformation. In its 2018 Rizwan message, the Universal House of Justice announced the approach of two centenaries, the ascension of Abdu'l-Bahá in November of 2021, followed by the centenary of the public reading of his Will and Testament in January 2022. These commemorations have taken the Baha'i world back in time to the house of Abdu'l-Bahá 100 years ago. I have written about these events in this book, which focuses on the 6 Western believers present at the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, and in this book, which offers an in-depth look at one of those Western believers who was not only present in the room of Abdu'l-Bahá just moments after his passing, but he was also present at one of the public readings of the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá. In The Priceless Pearl, Rihia Khanum writes that although the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá was read out to Shoghi Effendi soon after his arrival in Haifa, it had to be formally presented to members of the family and others in the Holy Land. Rihia Khanum explains that, I'm sorry, my slide skipped there. Okay. She explains that on the 3rd of January, 1922, in the presence of 9 persons, mainly senior members of Abdu'l-Bahā's family, and in Shoghi Effendi's absence, the Will and Testament was read, and its seal, signature, and handwriting were shown to those present. A few days later, a second public reading took place. John Bosch writes that on the 7th of January, 1922, just 40 days after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, at 9 in the morning, we were invited to assemble in the large hall of the residence of Abdu'l-Bahá to listen to the reading of his will. Yusuf Khan of Tehran began to chant the first part of the testament. He began at 9:55 a.m. and finished at 10:50. The second part was chanted by Muhammad Taqi of Cairo. That part finished at 11:20. Then followed the chanting of the third part by Yusuf Khan, which he finished at 11:45. At this reading of the Will and Testament, there were 120 persons present. Many had come especially from Cairo, Alexandria, Port Said, Jerusalem, Damascus, Beirut, Persia, India, and England. John Bosch said that there were 6 Americans present: Dr. Florian Krug and Mrs. Krug from New York, Mrs. Emma Jean Hogue from California, Mr. Curtis Kelsey from New York, and John and Louise Bosch from California. All had been present on the night of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, except for Emma Jean Hogue, who had been on a teaching trip to Italy and asked permission of the Greatest Holy Leaf to return to the Holy Land and be present at the reading of the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá. She explained that for the public reading of the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, the house was got ready, rugs were put on the floor, flowers decorated the rooms and halls, and Abdu'l-Bahā's picture was placed in view. The European and American women were seated with the others in the main hall, while the Oriental women sat in a room out of sight, but near enough to hear. Sounds of sobbing were heard. The impact was tremendous. Surely the sound of sobbing came from members of the household of Abdu'l-Bahá, from Munide Khanum, the wife of Abdu'l-Bahá, and from her 4 daughters. Despite their grief, the suffering could not have been more deeply felt than the suffering of the Greatest Holy Leaf, who alone maintained a calm that was an example to the Holy Family. In Shoghi Effendi's tribute to her, he wrote, "In the school of adversity, she learned through the example of the great sufferer, who was her father, the lesson she was destined to teach the great mass of his followers. Armed with the powers with which an intimate and long-standing companionship with Baha'u'llah had already equipped her, and benefiting by the magnificent example which the steadily widening range of Abdu'l-Bahā's activities afforded her, she was prepared to face the storm which the treacherous conduct of the covenant breakers had aroused, and to withstand its most damaging onslaughts. It was she who guided and protected the affairs of the household of Abdu'l-Bahá from the time of his ascension until Shoghi Effendi's arrival in the Holy Land on December 29th, when the contents of the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá could be read, and Shoghi Effendi's appointment as guardian of the cause of Baha'u'llah would be made clear in its opening pages. Salutation and praise, blessing and glory rest upon that primal branch of the divine and sacred lote tree, grown out, blessed, tender, verdant and flourishing from the twin holy trees. Well is it with him that seeketh the shelter of his shade, that shadoweth all mankind, for he is the blessed and sacred bough. Upon the shoulders of Shoghi Effendi would rest the responsibility to carry out the provisions of the Master's will, which included the building up of the divinely ordained administrative order and the expansion of the Baha'i community to all parts of the globe. On March 12, 1923, Shoghi Effendi wrote a seminal letter which outlined the features of the administrative order. It was addressed to the beloved of the Lord and the handmaids of the merciful throughout America, Great Britain, Germany, France, Switzerland, Italy, Japan, and Australasia. And It said, over a year has elapsed since that calamitous hour when the glorious person of Abdu'l-Bahá was veiled from mortal eyes and his spirit ascended to the kingdom of glory. And I feel that the time is now ripe to take those fresh and momentous decisions which will enable us to fulfill speedily and faithfully the last wishes of our departed master, one of which was the provision for the election of the Universal House of Justice. In that same letter of March 1923, the Guardian explained that it was of the utmost importance that the local spiritual assemblies be established throughout these nations, and where possible, national spiritual assemblies would be raised up, which in turn would elect the members of the Universal House of Justice. The Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá not only provided for the elected institutions of the cause, it also set forth the duties and functions of the hands of the cause of God, duties which would be extended to the appointed institutions of the cause, that is, the counselors and their auxiliaries. How fitting that the Universal House of Justice would call for 2 centenary commemorations in the Holy Land, one which would convene members of the elected institutions for the occasion of the centenary of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, followed by a convening of the members of the appointed institution to commemorate the centenary of the public reading of the Master's will. It was at this gathering of the counselors that the Universal House of Justice called for the followers of Baha'u'llah to extend the roots of his faith ever more deeply into the soil of society by relying on the society-building power of the cause. This society-building power is described by the Guardian in the World Order of Baha'u'llah, wherein he writes, conscious of their high calling, confident in the society-building power which their faith possesses, they press forward, undeterred and undismayed in their efforts to fashion and perfect the necessary instruments wherein the embryonic world order of Baha'u'llah can mature and develop. It is this building process, slow and unobtrusive, to which the life of the worldwide Baha'i community is wholly consecrated, that constitutes the one hope of a stricken society. For this process is actuated by the generating influence of God's changeless purpose and is evolving within the framework of the administrative order of his faith. After 100 years of carrying out the provisions of the Will and Testament, we can appreciate the Guardian's words in the World Order, wherein he says, they alone are aware of the silent growth of that orderly polity whose fabric they themselves are weaving. These 100 years of carrying out the provisions of the Will and Testament have given us the vision of what that world polity will look like, as we can see that world polity taking shape on Mount Carmel. At the apex of this far-flung arc is the seat of the Universal House of Justice, the supreme institution of the cause of Baha'u'llah. It is flanked by the Center for the Study of the Sacred Texts, which assists the Universal House of Justice in consulting the sacred writings, and by the International Teaching Center, which is specifically invested with the twin functions of the protection and propagation of the cause of God, and the institution of the International Archives, charged with the responsibility for the preservation of the sacred texts and the holy relics of the cause of God. And the future International Library, which will become an essential source of information on all subjects related to the cause of God and the conditions of mankind. At the center of this far-flung ark are the resting places of the members of the Holy Family who rest in the shadow of the monument of the greatest holy leaf, who passed away on July 15th, 1932. In a letter to an individual believer, Shoghi Effendi explained that the steps of the resting place of the greatest holy leaf represents the local spiritual assemblies. The columns are like the national spiritual assemblies, while the dome, which is raised following the placing of the columns, symbolizes the universal house of justice. These elected institutions of the faith, whose members are called the rulers, are guided by the appointed branch of the administrative order, whose members are called the learned, and whose function, in the words of the guardian, is not to dictate, but to consult on matters pertaining to the welfare of the cause of God and of humanity. Therefore, the principle of consultation is applied at every level of Baha'i administration. In the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, we see the society building power bequeathed to all the peoples of the world. This past year, Baha'is around the world have been reflecting on the life of Abdu'l-Bahá, who is the reflection of the light of the teachings of Baha'u'llah. The Universal House of Justice said that spiritual energies would be released after the commemoration of his passing and the reading of his will. In a letter written on behalf of the Guardian in 1930, it says, "The contents of the will of the Master are far too much for the present generation to comprehend. It needs at least a century of actual working before the treasures of wisdom hidden in it can be revealed." How thrilling, therefore, to see in this film, commissioned by the Universal House of Justice, a glimpse of the treasures that have been revealed after 100 years of endeavor. In this film, we meet Gerda Eif, who at the age of 100 has lived to tell the story of the fruits of victory that can result from the development of the individual, the community, and the institutions of the faith. She said, "I was born in Germany in 1921. At the end of World War II, I became a prisoner of war in Italy. In prison, our discussions often revolved around the meaning of life and religion. My heart and mind began to open to new ideas. Soon after returning to Germany, I met my husband-to-be. He had served with an armored division in northern Africa. We became friends with a group of Baha'is, learning about Baha'u'llah's teachings of the oneness of religion and the unity of mankind, a message that was simply astounding to us. It didn't take long until we became Baha'is. In 1957, we went on pilgrimage and met the beloved guardian. When he learned that my husband had fought in Africa, he encouraged him to return, this time with a message of love. On July 5th, 1959, with our 6 children, we arrived in Southwest Africa during the time of strict apartheid. It was forbidden for people of different races to be friends. Because we weren't allowed to gather openly, we had meetings in our homes to study Baha'u'llah's writings. Despite such hardship, we were grateful just to be together. A few years later, the first local spiritual assembly was elected, and this was the beginning of the Baha'i administration in Namibia. Since its election in 1963, the Universal House of Justice has guided communities across the globe in a worldwide effort to advance the spiritual development of the individual and society, which includes devotional gatherings, study circles, junior youth groups, and children's classes. In his Will and Testament, Abdu'l-Bahá writes that of all the gifts of God, the greatest is the gift of teaching. And he said that teaching the cause of God will draw the grace of God unto us. Therefore, the development of the spiritual capacity of the individual is fundamental to the society-building power of the cause, and it is an effort that relies on collaboration between the individual, the community, and the institutions of the faith, so that every individual soul may develop spiritual capacities within the wide embrace of the community and its institutions, with particular attention to the spiritual development of children and youth, ever mindful that a child who is 9 years old today will, in 9 years, be mature enough to participate in the election of her local spiritual assembly. The Guardian wrote that the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá bequeaths to us the very pattern of the new world order, destined to embrace, in the fullness of time, the whole of mankind. This is the copy of the Will and Testament that I have. When I look at it, I always think about its modest cover, which can, for some, belie the powerful contents in its pages. But the Guardian said that the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá confirms, supplements, and correlates the provisions of the Akdas because it gives us precepts on how to behave toward one another. For instance, in Part 1, paragraph 22, we are given such tremendous precepts on how to behave. It is the paragraph wherein Abdu'l-Bahá says, "O ye beloved of the world, in this sacred dispensation, conflict and contention are in no wise permitted." And later in the paragraph, he says, "So intense must be the spirit of love and loving kindness that the stranger may find himself a friend, the enemy a true brother, no difference whatsoever existing between them. For universality is of God, and all limitations earthly. Regarding this, restrictions and limitations are in no wise permitted. Indeed, the door of the house of Baha'u'llah is wide open, and within the framework of his administrative order, every soul may find sanctuary." I wanted to end this presentation by reminding you that this presentation was created entirely by me, and so any mistakes in it are entirely my own, especially any misunderstanding is entirely my own. Archival photos are the copyright of the United States Baha'i Archives, and some photos are from these websites and may be subject to copyright. MediaBaha'i.org has put up some wonderful new photographs. It's the website of the Baha'i International Community, as is newsbaha'i.org. And there is a photograph that I took from Baha'iBlog.net, which has some wonderful articles written by Soniel Vreeland. They're just absolutely wonderful. I welcome you to visit that site. And also many of the photographs, including the cover of When the Moon Set Over Haifa, is from this website, Luminous Pot, where the photographer Farzam says that any of the photographs on it can be used by anyone who wishes to use them. And he's so generous in sharing them. The photograph of the room of Abdu'l-Bahá cannot be used without permission by the House of Justice, and it was taken by Denny Allen and used in this presentation for the Wilmette Institute by permission of the Universal House of Justice. The book When the Moon Set Over Haifa and the book John David Bosch really would be of interest to anyone interested in feeling like you'd like to go back in time and really be in the room in any of the rooms of the House of Abdu'l-Bahá. And of course, they are available at BahaiBookstore.com. And that concludes my presentation today. I wanted to leave time, make it short or shorter than usual, so that we have time to think about what are those hidden mysteries and treasures revealed after 100 years of the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá being actually in practice, and what is it that we've learned? And so maybe in addition to questions, we might also just have people make some observations that Rob can read aloud.
Thank you, Angie. And I should add that I just posted in chat an information about a discount code. If anybody wants to purchase the book John David Bosch by Angelina Allen, the Baha'i Publishing Trust has created this WUDB discount code. So you would have to go to, I guess it's Baha'i Bookshop or BahaiBookstore.org or .com. I never quite remember which it is. And buy the book and use the discount code. So yes. I put that in the chat for anyone who's interested, and it's very kind of the Publishing Trust to make that available.
And I want to mention the general manager of the Publishing Trust. His name is Nat Yogachandra, and he is really such a source of joy because everything he does is according to the really the theme of the Publishing Trust, which is to disseminate the Word of God. And by buying books from the Publishing Trust, we are assisting in that effort of disseminating the Word of God.
Yeah, and they really do a marvelous job. And Nat is a special guy, and
he sure is.
I am very impressed by the work that he does. Someone raised their hand, and I should point out that when you raise your hand, that normally means we would turn on your microphone and camera, but we don't do that in these webinars because there's too many people. We have 116 people on today. It's too difficult to try and turn on someone's microphone and camera. So please just post your comments either in the Q&A or in the chat feature, and we will get to them and read them aloud, and that way you'll be able to participate. Quite a few comments. I'm now in the chat. Quite a few comments right now. Someone asked about captions and live transcript setup. I don't think we have it set up live, but once it's up on our YouTube channel, there will be a transcript that YouTube automatically generates. It will have inevitable problems with transliteration of words and foreign words, but you generally can figure out what it's saying. And in fact, if anyone wants to volunteer to help us clean up transcripts, we have a way of downloading them and sending them to you. And you can check them out, clean them up, send them back to us, and we can upload them again. And we actually would love to have any interest in assisting us that way, because we have a lot of videos up there, and we've only been able to fix a few of the transcripts so far. A few other people. Helen says, "Hi, Angie. Hope you and your family are well. It's been 40 years or so since we saw each other in Costa Rica."
Helen Mirkovic. Yes. Hi, Helen. Sister mine. My sister Dawn is online too, and so I'm sure she'd like me to send you her greetings.
One person says, looks like Daniel, "Thank you so much for this remarkable and succinct presentation. Thank you also for all the research you've made and written. about in your book on the life of my compatriot John Bosch and his wife Louise. Several other people saying thank you. Some people are saying they can't see the comments in chat, but they are in chat, so I don't know. Try turning it off and turning it back on, and they may pop up because a lot of people are clearly doing this. And the discount code, someone says please repost, but it's right there. Is it WIJDB? I think that's what it is. So it's right there in the chat. So there are a few more comments. Several people are saying the link is not showing, and I don't know what to do. Someone else has posted it, so I guess maybe now it's up there. Excuse me here. A bit of post-COVID, I think, here.
Oh.
Actually, it's only just a cold, but it's still sometimes hanging on. Serene says, we've seen the vision of Abdu'l-Bahá come into being, the guardianship, the NSAs, the LSAs, and the election of the Universal House of Justice. And I think that's very true. It's been very impressive to watch the Will and Testament just unroll like a rug over the last century.
I like how she said that, the vision of Abdu'l-Bahá. I like that, Serene. It is his vision, and now we're seeing that vision virtually because of the way we just function, but also physically on the ark on Mount Carmel.
One person asked, how long was it that the Iranian women had to sit separately events like this? And I don't know if we have a really good answer to that. Some of it had to do with the Iranian women being more comfortable in a separate room because they weren't used to being around with men, certainly not yet in the early 20s.
Yes, and you know, in Baha'í's Ma'ani's book called Leaves, it's so good. It's such a good book. And also, of course, in The Priceless Pearl, there is that reminder that many of those customs were kept not because they were Baha'i customs, but because they were Eastern customs at the time. So, you know, we just have to remember that everything is in transition. I mean, even the way we live today is not according to Baha'i principles.
Yeah.
So you don't look back about how we are today and go, wow. So it's a little bit hard to hear that, though, that they were in a room to the side, but that the American and European women were in the main hall because that would have been the Western custom.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and similarly, American Baha'i men generally didn't meet the greatest holy leaf or Monere Khanum.
That's right.
But the Western Baha'i women did.
That's so right. Those lucky Western Baha'i women.
They were, because they could actually be in both worlds, whereas the Western Baha'i men really couldn't easily be in the Andaruni, the inner sanctum of the house of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Yeah.
And there was another thought that occurred to me about this, and that's that if I believe I have the dates right, my wife's great-grandparents went to Paris in the 30s when one of their sons started to go to the Sorbonne. And that's when the family switched to Western clothing. Because they could buy it easily there. I'm sure there was already beginning to be available in Iran.
Yeah. You know, there's a scene in the Moon, when the Moon Set Over Haifa, where it's in the Joanna Hauf chapter, where it explains that when Abdu'l-Bahá arrived in Stuttgart, he asked his entourage to change from their, and in the words of Hassan Balyuzi, from their Oriental garb. And it's just interesting that Abdu'l-Bahá made sure that change was made as they entered this Western city. I just think it's interesting. Another thing I wanted to mention is that is Emma Jean Hogue. You know, when we put together When the Moon Set Over Haifa, we really had to keep it to the 6 Western believers who were present on the night of the Ascension. Although Emma Jean Hogue was there at the reading of the will, she doesn't figure into into a chapter in When the Moon Set Over Haifa. And it might be an interesting research project for someone to research her. She is considered the first native Californian to become a Baha'i, and from that point until the end of her life is a very interesting story, one of which is that she was called to the Holy Land to help the Guardian type up the Dawnbreakers. She was one of the persons who helped the Guardian translate the early passages of the Will and Testament. She pioneered to South Carolina at the end of her life and is buried there. So that's a book worth thinking about. I don't have time. I'm not going to take that one on, but that might be one for someone to want, be interested in taking on, is to tell the story of Imogene Hogue. And you can start with, there's an article about her at Baha'i Library Online. If you just type in Imogene Hogue, you'll get to it.
When did she arrive in Haifa if she wasn't there at the time of the ascension?
Okay, so she was there right before. That was during my presentation, I clicked the slide too fast, and anyway, there's a little jump there that I didn't get to make clear. So I'll make it clear right now. She was present in Haifa before the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Oh, yeah.
And he asked her to go on a teaching trip to Italy, which she did. She left Haifa and went to Italy. And she was in Italy when she got a cable telling her that the master had passed away. She cabled the Greatest Holy Leaf back and asked permission to return to the Holy Land, which she was given permission. And that's how she was there for the reading of the will. And there were many visits. She was married, but they were a childless couple, and her husband gave her freedom to travel back and forth to the Middle East whenever she wanted to.
That's good. She was a friend of Phoebe Hearst, then, I suppose.
Yes.
Well, she wasn't on the first pilgrimage?
No, unless I have that wrong.
I don't remember.
Where's Kathy Hoganson? I need her right now.
We need her. Right. Someone has the spelling, I believe, correctly there in the chat also. Hoag, H-O-A-G-G, or Hogue.
Yeah, yes.
That's
in
correct.
some places, you'll see her name is spelled with an I, Imogene, and in some places, Emogene with an E, and then but it's Hogue, H-O-A-G-G.
Yeah. One person asks, was there a translation provided to the American Baha'is during the reading of the Will and Testament, or did they speak Persian well enough to understand?
No. And John Bosch explains that no, there was no translation. The European and West and American believers in the room, if they did not understand Persian or Arabic, because parts of it are in Arabic, they did not understand what was being said. Although John Bosch makes it clear that it was made clear to them what it said. So they learned later. But people like Imogene Hogue would have understood what was being said because she spoke Persian and Arabic. So, and I'm trying to think of others. None of the others would have. The Bosches didn't. The Krugs did not. Joanna Hauff was studying Persian in that month, and so she may have understood part of it, but it was explained to them later.
Yeah, and in fact, translation was something I'm sure the Guardian wanted to do carefully also, so there wouldn't have been any probably quick, spontaneous translation at that time, because you'd worry about a misinterpretation getting spread around orally or something. I would think that would be an issue anyway. And one person says, it's been a long time since I studied the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá. What is the most specific reference the master makes to Shoghi Effendi as guardian? And there's quite a few, it seems to me.
Yeah, and quite a few. And so, I mean, one way to do that might be to go online and get the Will and Testament from Baha'i Reference Library, copy and paste it into a Word document, and then just search the word Shoghi. and you'll see everywhere where it comes up. I mean, I'm revealing some of the ways I do things. If I want to just know right away, I just do it that way. Someone in the online right now might know how many times it's mentioned. I can't say how many times, but it kind of in relation to that. I think many people who pick up the Will and Testament would be struck by how much time Abdu'l-Bahá spends on talking about the injuries done by the covenant breakers.
Yes.
And certainly that would explain the sobbing that Imogen Hogue describes, that to hear after Abdu'l-Bahá's passing how painful life was for him. And so, of course, it's important to remember that that Abdu'l-Bahá's half-brother was named to follow Abdu'l-Bahá. And because he turned away from the covenant, that, negated any chances he had of following Abdu'l-Bahá in leadership of the cause. So Abdu'l-Bahá had to make it very explicit what his transgressions were, so that there would be absolutely no question as to whether or not he was faithful to the covenant of Baha'u'llah or not. I would say we should read it with this reassurance of, this is the reassurance we have that of Abdu'l-Bahá's fairness, that he was being fair by saying, these are the transgressions of Mirza Muhammad Ali.
Right. Someone points out it's paragraph 16. And is one place where it's mentioned. And I should add that there are a lot of indirect references to Shoghi Effendi as well. Yes. And that those were then clear to people in context, not only in the Will and Testament, but other places as well. So often if you read the thing, sometimes some of these indirect references, you're not quite sure how obvious they were to people, but they were really quite obvious to the people at the time. From what I can see anyway, as you do more research and you see the context of these things. That's also true of Baha'u'llah's appointment of Abdu'l-Bahá. He didn't make it really explicit until the very end, but the Tablet of the Branch was written about Abdu'l-Bahá in the Adrianople period, which is in 1868 or so. So it clearly, it was clear to people that things were going in that direction, you might say, but Baha'u'llah actually made it specific towards the end. And that could also have been a protection for Abdu'l-Bahá. It might have encouraged people to poison him or something. Same way with Shoghi Effendi, because when Abdu'l-Bahá came to the West, he never mentioned the guardianship in his talks. He talked about the House of Justice, but he never talked about the guardianship. But that's because the future guardian was 15 years old, and he had to be worrying about Shoghi Effendi's safety. I would assume that that's one of the reasons. Let me see, someone else, someone asked this question, how long did it take for the English translation to come out? Do we know?
In the Priceless Pearl, Rihia Khanum explains that the Guardian selected 8, pretty sure she says 8, passages to be translated and sent to the major communities. Also in the book called John Bosch, in the Vanguard of Heroes, Martyrs and Saints, there's a whole section of how after the reading of the will, John and Louise Bosch were invited by Shoghi Effendi to see the picture of Baha'u'llah, and then he took them into his office and handed them a portion of the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, a translated portion, and asked them to deliver it to the American Baha'i community, which John and Louise Bosch did. They would have been en route back to the United States, spent some time on a teaching trip in Europe, and actually landed at the train station in Chicago, and went directly to the house of worship where John Bosch says, my name was called as delegate. So he just gets there just in time to say, I've just returned and here's what I have. And of course, but the Greatest Holy Leaf had already cabled the United States and Persia. The Rihya Khanum says the two major communities, Baha'i communities in the world, she had already cabled them the news.
Right.
But it's just kind of it's just a delightful story of John Bosch sort of arriving and saying, I made it just in time to deliver this.
And as delegate, he can even stand up and speak.
Yeah.
Another question here. This is very interesting. At the end of part 1, it is written, this written paper hath for a long time been preserved underground, damp having affected it. When brought forth to the light, it was observed that certain parts of it were injured by the damp, and the Holy Lamb being sorely agitated, it was left untouched. Can you please comment about this? Are those parts lost forever?
I'm going to defer to you, but I always like that as it's a certification by Abdu'l-Bahá. He's certifying the document and saying in his own handwriting, this damage was not, to this document was not inflicted by a person. Yeah. And so therefore the words you're looking at have not been altered. And also it tells us that he hid it. Yeah. So, but Robert, what do you say?
I think you're exactly right. I'm assuming that it's not saying a chunk of it got destroyed. It's just simply saying that it was affected by the damp. So maybe the paper is crinkly or something, or maybe the ink got smeared a little bit. But I'm assuming that it was perfectly legible.
Yeah.
And that Abdu'l-Bahá is just signifying that this damage was accidental.
He's saying, I buried this treasure. So if you see any mud on it, it's because I buried it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. That's my impression as well. When did the Bosches leave Haifa? Do you remember roughly? Was the Guardian still there, or had the Guardian already left as well?
No, they left at the end of January. And of course, the Guardian didn't go to Switzerland until April 8th. Or again, I might be.
I was going to say March, April. I don't remember the date.
No, it was April, but not. I think it was actually the 8th, but it was April. And so the Greatest Holy Leaf invited the Bosches to stay and mourn with the family, and so that's how they were there for such a long time. As was Joanna Hauf invited to stay because Abdu'l-Bahá had organized for Persian and Arabic teachers to teach her Persian and Arabic so she could translate the Baha'i writings into German. The Krugs left by February and went to Europe, and then eventually back to the United States, although Dr. Krug ended up passing away in Europe. No, he did not make it his way back to the United States. Yes. Wow. I didn't say this in the book, but because I can't verify it, but I really think that he died of a broken heart. I think that the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá he couldn't live anymore. He got ill and never recovered. And his story, someone was asking me recently, okay, so When the Moon Set Over Haifa has these 4 chapters about these believers, and each one tells their path to the faith and how they ended up in Haifa during these 2 momentous occasions. But each chapter also tells you something about the Baha'i faith. So the John and Louise Bosch chapter tells you, I think, about how it is that each one of us develops this deeply personal connection with Abdu'l-Bahá. You and I, all of us, we all feel Abdu'l-Bahá is our own, and to us, he's stronger in our hearts than anyone else. He's mine and mine alone. I mean, how does that develop in us? And that chapter really explores how that happens. And of course, I think for me in my head, it focuses on that line from Abdu'l-Bahá when he said to John Bosch, with you, I'd sleep in the basement. And that really captures that personal feeling we have about Abdu'l-Bahá. The chapter on the Krugs, I think, explores doubt. And Dr. Krug had doubts about the validity of this cause, and his transformation is tremendous and gives up everything. His 5 surgeries in New York, his reputation as a doctor, gives it all up to go to Haifa to be a physician for the family of Abdu'l-Bahá. And he's ridiculed in the newspapers for doing so. And he doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him. And look how he's now remembered.
Yeah.
And none of those people who ridiculed him, we don't know their names. And then the story of Joanna Hauf is the story of what it means to translate and to bring this word of God to all the peoples of the world. It has to carry the power of that word. And so translating it has to carry that. And that chapter explores that. And then finally, the chapter on Curtis Kelsey, to me, it explores that wish that each one of us has, to offer at least one significant service to the threshold of Baha'u'llah. Just one.
Mm-hmm.
And Curtis Kelsey's example is such an inspiration of that, of just offering one. Here he's I'm sort of an electrician. Sure, I could put on the electricity
these things
for the Shrine of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. To him, it wasn't even, he didn't look at it as something that was his. He thought of it as, this is Abdu'l-Bahá's effort that I'm just putting the wire in. So maybe we're all like that. We're just connecting the wires to light up the world.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It seems to me, speaking of people who couldn't live without the master, that Helen Goodall in California, the mother of the Baha'i community really in the Bay Area, also passed away not long after Abdu'l-Bahá did, of a broken heart, from what I gather. Mm-hmm. It was very difficult for many of the early believers to imagine the faith without Abdu'l-Bahá. Mm-hmm. And some of them came around to loving Shoghi Effendi very deeply and very quickly also, which is a whole story of its own.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what book are you thinking of writing next?
Oh gosh, I need to paint the front of my house. I love painting. I really do. I love painting interiors of houses and exterior. And I need to do that. The front of the house needs paint. So I'm going to do that next. It's starting to show some weather damage. But I've always really wanted, and I just hope I'm given an opportunity to write on the life of Keith Ransom Kaler. It's who I first wanted to write about when I first started the John Bosch book. I just want to share this story only because it's just so delightful. I'd gone into the archives. This was a long time ago, 2008 maybe. And I said, I'm thinking about researching for a book on the life of Keith Ransom Kaler, and I'm wondering if I could, have all her papers. And of course, the archive just says, here, those treasures are for us to have and to hold. And, but then I said to Mr. Dahl, I said, well, if someone else is writing a book on Keith Ransom Kaler, that's fine. I'll work on something else. And he looked at me and he said, many books can be written on Keith Ransom Kaler.
I think that's true. Yeah.
And I think that's true about John Bosch, about these Western believers, about the history of our faith will continue to grow and be written. And as we learn more and more, we'll get the story more and more correct as more and more information becomes available to us. Yeah. And so there's a lot for us to do, many opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And as one person once observed to me, every generation has to rediscover these people and these events. And every generation we have new insights. I mean, we can now talk about how Abdu'l-Bahá accompanied people, and we couldn't even say that phrase in a way people would understand 25 years ago, Mm-hmm. So we learn about the faith. We learn about the meaning, the relationship with how the teachings connect. And then we go back in history and we find it there too.
Mm-hmm.
So every generation reads the history, the documents differently, and sees different insights in it. And so, yes, there'll be a time when all these people will need new biographies and need for new histories. And in that sense, the story never ends, because history is a very rich source of insights for today and for the future.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's very true. And I do hope you get to write one on Keith Ransom Kaler. That's
well, and I did actually, I wrote something and put together her diary papers, which is hundreds and hundreds of papers, and then
really? Wow.
Wrote introductions about her travels and so on. And the House of Justice actually said that not at this time, because her work in Persia, when she went there to appeal to the Shah, to allow for the free flow of Baha'i literature in and out of the country, she never succeeded in doing that, and then she died there. And it's interesting that well, let me just finish this other thought, that the House of Justice felt that right now is not the time to tell that story, because it's perhaps a little bit challenging to the government of Iran. Right. And so there are parts of her story that have to wait, but there'll be a time. In fact, when I think about her, I think, well, she failed in her effort to appeal to the Shah. But when she passed away in Isfahan, the Guardian sent out a cable to the Baha'is of the world and said that she is the valiant emancipator of her Persian brethren. So he gave her a title or an epithet that describes how she will be regarded in the future. Although she may have failed in her efforts in the 1930s, right, in the future, she will be regarded as the person who began that emancipation by appealing to the Shah, even if at that time it ended in failure.
That's very interesting. And one other question we have here. Someone has been reading about Bahia Khanum and was wondering if we know the day of her birth, or even the month of her birth. The year we know as I think, was it 46? She was born in 46 or 48?
Someone can look this up. I mean, I'm sure someone's looking it up right now online. Exact. I mean, you're asking for the actual date.
Yeah, it's possible we don't know. Also, it's possible because people did not have birth certificates in those days.
Yes.
Even with Shoghi Effendi, we're not quite sure of the year of his birth.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that problem.
Did someone just time him in?
No, that's something else that popped up here, but I don't see an answer to this particular question.
Yeah,
I guess the best thing to do otherwise is to ask all-knowing Google.
Well, we do know that she was born in 1846, but the actual date, I don't know.
Yeah.
But by the way, I always like to say, well, if your house were burning down, what would you grab? What would you take? And which Baha'i books would you take? Even if you could get them all online, yeah. I would run out of the house with this book. It is absolutely wonderful.
It is.
This book. It's the book that I would make sure I grab, of how much Baha Khanum stood, how firmly she stood at the helm of the cause in its darkest hour. The sun had set, Baha'u'llah. The moon had set, Abdu'l-Bahá. Shoghi Effendi had gone to Switzerland to conquer himself so he could be ready to stand at the helm of this cause. And he left the faith in the hands of Baha Khanum. Never in the history of a world religion has a woman stood at the helm of the faith, except in the Baha'i faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
The book Leaves and this book is just a wonderful place for people to start.
An amazing writer. An amazingly wise writer. I read it when it came out years and years ago, and I was very impressed. Very impressed. And I thank you for bringing it up, because it really is well worth people reading it. We have another comment here from Paula. Listening to you is so very inspiring. Thank you so much. I met Martin AIFF at a pioneer conference at the House of Worship in Langenheim. He had come to Germany just for this conference. So inspiring that you include Mrs. Aif at her 100th birthday in your presentation. Several of the Aif children are living in Germany now. Thank you so much for this inspiring presentation.
Oh, Paula, how wonderful. I knew of her because, of course, Ted Cardell is the Knight of Baha'u'llah to Southwest Africa. And so I knew of the Aifs because we know of the story of Ted Cardell. I knew Ted Cardell, so wonderful. He worked at Bosch Baha'i School. And so when in that film, Glimpses of 100 Years of Endeavor, I didn't know that she was still alive. And here she is, 100 years old. And so I took screen cap shots of the film and decided to include it in this in case someone hasn't had a chance to see that film. And even if you have, it's such a wonderful story of really personal transformation. She was a Nazi. She went to war for the Nazis. So there's that picture of her with the Nazi emblem. And she was completely transformed. It proves the power of this cause in this one person who is a physical representation of the 100 years we are commemorating.
Yeah, that's very true. And we have several people whose comments have come in here. One person says the introduction to the Bahia Khanum book just says 1846 for her birth. Mm-hmm. Martine Blythe says that the Aif's daughter, Rosie, is still in Namibia. Paula adds, all of her children went to Namibia to celebrate her birthday. It was this year, and she's still alive and healthy.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Paula, for telling us that.
God bless her for her service to the faith. I think we're probably just about out of our time and our questions. I don't see anybody others. Oh, another person, Brigitte Aif, serves at the World Center. So there's another interesting piece of information.
Oh, thank you, Martine, for telling us. Paula and Martine, this is wonderful to hear this news because I think many of us wondered, we want to know more about her.
Yeah, and Curtis Kelsey's, of course, grandchildren are all over the world serving as well. Mm-hmm. That's also worth mentioning as well. So, I guess there's another Q&A here. I can't get down. Paul says there's a Q&A, but I can't get down to one other than his name. So I don't see it there. People are asking whether anything's been written about Mrs. Aif, and I don't believe that's true, but apparently you can find the daughters on Facebook as well and see photos, which is good to know. Let's see if I can. There we go. A bio of Keith Ransom Kaler has been published by Janet Rouchon, A Love Which Does Not Wait. So we do have. Yes,
there's a chapter on her in that book. Yeah. Yes. But it excludes some of the, in her diary papers, which I have, there, she makes some very challenging statements about the government.
Yeah.
And just can't be published. It may never be published. You know.
Yeah. Perhaps in 100 years, we'll see. We'll see. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Angie. Angie, we're very appreciative of your participation today and your encyclopedic knowledge about this subject and, of course, the great importance of this subject. And so we're very, very appreciative of the time that you've been able to give us.
Thank you. I don't feel I have an encyclopedic knowledge, though. I feel like I have a curiosity, and I am surrounded by my wonderful mother and father-in-law, Ken and Mary Allen, and my father, Ed Diliberto, and I have 6 other brothers and sisters that we talk about the faith constantly. So I get a lot from them.
Sure.
I really do.
Well, it gives you an encyclopedic curiosity, if nothing else.
Yeah. Yes.
And that, of course, really does pay off over the decades with those kinds of conversations. So again, thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone today for joining us and joining this really fascinating conversation. And as I said, in 2 weeks, we will hear a presentation about the Baha'i faith and the United Nations and what we have learned about public discourse through our time working at the United Nations. So until then, I want to thank everyone for participating, and we look forward to seeing you again at another date. Thank you and goodbye.
Yeah, thank you.